Hey there, DF. I was thinking about the insane hype that the PS3 had for its capabilities before we actually saw it in action. And said hype inevitably caused a great deal of disappointment and perhaps a cautionary tale about getting ahead of ourselves when it comes to unproven tech. Why exactly was the PS3 so underwhelming, and why did it struggle to achieve parity with the 360 for so long? It's generally agreed that parity was more or less achieved in 2010. Nah.
No, it
And the
wasn't.
PS3
So
slightly outperformed the 360 in some cases. Some cases. I don't think we'll ever see similar hype in the future, but it's still one of the most interesting consoles that's ever been released. Well, we can talk about the hype. I think that's sort of separate to the reality, and the reality was quite straightforward. Xbox delivered a machine that had close development similarities with PC and had a really good GPU. And Sony delivered a console with a very exotic CPU architecture that took a lot of effort to get to grips with. But even then, it still had a much weaker GPU. So that's why there was that disparity. But John, let's talk about the hype and the disappointment, because it's kind of weird, because I do remember when the PlayStation 3 launched, yeah, some of the ports were poor, but then you saw something like MotorStorm and you thought, wow, this is something that Xbox isn't doing, and could be something really great. So it's kind of a bit weird, the whole PS3 launch situation, isn't it?
Yeah, and there were reports, sort of like Ridge Racer 7 was kind of an enhanced port of Ridge Racer 6, right? And that was
and it
native
obviously
1080p,
better,
and it looked better. It was so out of the gate, it seemed like there was potential there, because obviously the 2005 showcase they held for PS3 was like extremely. That was the one time where Sony went all in on like non-accurate, non-realistic demos. Like prior to that, when they showed PlayStation 1 and 2, even though people were blown away by those demos, they were all real time running on the hardware. And then PS3 comes along and most of those demos were not at all. Like, remember when I did the MotorStorm DF Retro and those guys were like watching the press conference together, they said, and like when it came on and they showed that trailer and Phil Harrison was like, oh yeah, that's real time in game. They said like everybody that was watching it got quiet and just like looked at each other like, are you kidding? All we have is like boxes driving around a track. like, like they knew. They were like, it doesn't exist yet, Phil. Like, what are you doing? So like that immediately put pressure on them and Guerrilla Games, of course. But I think in the end, the thing about PS3 is that I do think the CPU was interesting and allowed them to do some really cool stuff that was unique and impressive. And it really came down to developers learning to use the CPU like a GPU. Basically, right? Like
Yes.
you look at like Naughty Dog, like, oh yeah, all their post-processing, motion blur, everything was being done on the CPU instead of the GPU because the GPU sucked. And fundamentally the GPU, so that was the big stumbling block, I think. Well, one of two, because PS3, obviously the CPU was tricky to work on, even though the 360's tri-core CPU used the same PowerPC style core as Cell, because they literally just ripped it off, as we know from that book.
Yes.
But it was the SPU stuff that was tricky, which was like, they were just, specialized parallel processing cores kind of, which today makes a lot more sense. But at the time, they weren't actual like general purpose cores. They were like more, like
vector
processors, right? Which PS2 also had vector processors like that, but this was a little bit more insane. But it sounds like that the original idea was that Toshiba made GPU, which would have been interesting to see, and it just didn't come to fruition. And I think it's just the fact that didn't work out is what hurt the PS3 the most, because then they had to scramble at the last minute to get what they could. Obviously, you're coming to NVIDIA late in the game and like, we need a GPU, please help. Like, what do you think is going to happen? Like, they don't have enough time to architect something from the ground up for this machine. So they just take what they've been working on and sort of leverage that and turn it into a console GPU.
Yeah.
It's a console product. And it just didn't, it feels like it didn't really belong there. Like, it wasn't well integrated into the machine. You see that with the split memory pool and just like all of its various deficiencies. So when you have this GPU issue combined with the difficult to use CPU, like a lot, especially early on, a lot of those PS3 ports were just using like just the main PowerPC core. and not SPUs like at all.
That's right.
And then the GPU, of course, if you just did everything on the GPU as you would do on a 360, it just wasn't strong enough, and it would just struggle to run well. And we saw that all over the place. But even early on, stuff like MotorStorm, I mean, that was not the magic of the PS3. That was the magic of very smart, talented developers that just, they knew how to leverage what they had there. They came up with cool solutions to the problems they faced and produced amazing results. And, those could have been done on a 360, no problem, I'm sure.
Yeah, it's like Naughty Dog and basically all of the key first-party developers.
Yeah, it would just be like, instead of having a lot of stuff like John talked about earlier, spending all this time to make it run on a SPU, you would just run it on the Xenos GPU at that point.
Exactly.
Right? And if you go into those, like, really, we did a Battlefield 3 retro PC time capsule, and if you go into their presentations about it, they spend a lot of time in their presentations talking about how they're doing like shading on the SPUs, and for that they have like a really small section on the 360 where they're like, we just do it on the GPU there, and it's like they had to spend all this time. Like, that's the one thing I would think it makes a successful console, which PS4 did way better than Xbox One, was that it was easier to program for, and it was sensible and had power that was easily unlocked on day one. And then with a bit more over time. But SPUs were like, here's an entirely different paradigm, and we don't have a good balanced system otherwise. Use it wisely. And then no one did for like 5 years or whatever. So, yeah, it's a weird time.
It is cool though. I think it's neat that it existed. It's just impractical with where development was going at that point.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, the PS3 was kind of a weird thing because it was Sony who were basically, they'd owned the console market with PlayStation 2. It was gigantically successful. And yeah, they just thought they could basically architect the future of gaming with PlayStation 3. And, I guess they wanted to do more than that. They wanted the cell to be something really, really special just beyond gaming as well.
Right.
But it just didn't really happen. The direction of travel was moving in different directions. And then, of course, Microsoft comes out with 360, which does have more in common with PC development, which developers are more familiar with. And, the story writes itself from there on.
It's just, it's interesting to me, though, that in the end, the 360 was a much better machine, but the PlayStation 3 went on to outsell it. So 360 was the best-selling Xbox in history, and PlayStation 3 was the worst. Was it? Except for the PS5, which is still active, it was the worst actual home console that Sony had in terms of sales, but it still outsold the 360.
I think
what could they have done differently? Like, what could have been done to make the 360 actually come out on top?
I think there's just a major branding issue in Europe. PlayStation is almost synonymous with console gaming in Europe. Nintendo
and Japan,
aside.
Of course, yeah.
Well. Japan, I'd say, was a much smaller market, but Xbox was really strong in North America and the UK, and it was kind of much less successful elsewhere,
mainly in Europe.
Yeah, so that's that. I think that explains that. I think going forward, the sort of hype of the future, it's really difficult to actually bet against the hype, because by the time the new consoles arrive, the stuff we're going to be seeing will have been proven out on PC. We're already seeing it. Frame generation, DLSS. We're starting to see AI features come to the fore. That's what all the next generation is going to be. So sort of overhyping the future. It's all being proven out now on PC. It's all being tested, and developers are getting to grips with it. So I don't think we're going to have a PlayStation 3 situation in the future. But who knows?
Man, I just have these numbers up, and I'm always astounded when I see the PSP sold nearly as much as the 360.
PSP.
Yeah.
The PSP sold so damn well. That was, like, people talk like it's not a success, but I think it's just because the DS sold so much, but the PSP sold a ton of units.
Did well, that's why we got a Vita.
And then the Vita, of course, was a galactic failure on par with the Wii U, basically.
Hey, I got some
and the Master System.
Anecdotally, I can say I went to a flea market this weekend and I saw more PSP games than I saw DS games. I thought that was really confusing. But,
Interesting.
Yeah. I also, the hype though is something you can't like de-emphasize enough. I definitely remember back in that time, when the specs came out and you saw all the cores that the PS3 had available to it. We didn't really understand what the GPU differences would be because we didn't know what ATI had been cooking, and it was different than what we saw in the past. So it was hard to get a grips at that. And then you had all these demos and these, these phrases from like Sony about like, wow, what the SPUs can do, and it just made it sound like a magical device, especially when you saw that Killzone demo back in the day and they were telling you it's real time. You're just like, this looks way better than anything I've ever seen before. How is this real time? So I think you can't ignore that, I think, to this whole story. That's a huge part of it.
I always think though, like, man, Sony was so close to having G80 in the PS3.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Like if they just had a little more time, they could have had that instead, and I think it would have changed everything about the system.
Yeah, speaking of hype, I was just going back to the PlayStation 4 reveal, and Mark Cerny was talking about a quote-unquote supercharged PC architecture, which kind of says it all, really.
Mm-hmm.
It's a PC. The big thing at the time, I guess, was the fact that it was almost like a 360 playbook. Accelerated, if you like, by just going full PC. And then, of course, they dropped the bomb of the 8 gigs of memory, which was just awesome. That was like the last advantage that Microsoft enjoyed in its Xbox One design, and that was that. And, it was, as Mark Cerny said, it was a developer-led design. And I think, it's going to be very similar going forward. All depends really on what style of PC componentry we're going to see condensed in the new consoles.